Hi everyone, Miss Hart here. Today we're going to be talking about the late Middle Ages, particularly the collapse of the medieval system. But before I get into that, I want you to pause this video for a second and grab your notebook if you haven't already. I'd really like you to take notes on this video lecture as well as jot down any questions you might have for me in class. Alright, if everyone's ready, let's begin. If I had to choose one word to describe Europe in the 14th century, it's crisis. In the late Middle Ages, i.e. like the 14th century, also known as the 1300s, Europeans saw an almost unprecedented level of political, social, and religious calamity. First, the bubonic plague claimed the lives of around 1/3 of the people living in Europe, although some historians put this number closer to 40%. Second, a prolonged war between Britain and France, called the 100 Years' War, negatively affected the soldiers who fought in it, the peasants who paid for it, as well as the developing nation-states throughout the continent. Additionally, the one unifying force of Europe that everyone could always count on, the Roman Catholic Church, faced a number of issues in this century that undermined its authority in the eyes of believers. And last, but certainly not least, the Ottoman Turks, who had conquered much of the Middle East with their gunpowder cannons, finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, which was the end of the Christian Byzantine Empire. As their political and religious institutions collapsed, or were at the very least in crisis mode, Europeans viewed this time period as the beginning of the end of Western civilization. And, as we're going to see throughout this first unit, it's the collapse of the medieval system that's going to make way for the birth of the modern world. Now let's go a little more in-depth into each one of these crises. The Black Death, which was known scientifically as the bubonic plague, swept over Europe between the mid-14th century, really 1348 and 1350, leaving as many as 40% of the population dead, and is considered one of the great natural disasters in history. We can see here when we examine this map that the plague arrives in Europe in 1347, first in Italy. Now, why Italy? Well, its peninsula location made it a prime hub of trade in the Mediterranean Sea. You see, the bubonic trade was traveling west along the Silk Road to the Middle East. You can see here when we look at this map, it starts off in 1320s in China and slowly but surely is traveling west. Once in the Middle East, it isn't long before the first cases crop up in Europe. The main carriers for this disease were the fleas that lived on the bodies of rats. Rats were everywhere during this time period, and it didn't take much for a flea to jump from a rat to the body of a human being, transferring the bubonic bacteria through its bite. Once a person contracted the Black Death, they would die a slow, painful, and gruesome death, often suffering for weeks as sores on their bodies formed and burst open, oozing pus and blood. Unfortunately, medieval European medicine was not really up to the task. European doctors did not really understand what was causing the plague, and thus couldn't treat it or stop it. Naturally, Europeans turned to the church for help. Here you can see a priest help a sick and fallen man, someone who's dying of the plague. However, many church officials turned their backs on the sick and dying in fear for their own lives. This is going to get people to think twice about the infallibility of the Roman Catholic Church, and it really weakens its power, its authority. Many Europeans saw the plague as a punishment from God, and either blamed it on the sins of man, or sometimes even on the presence of Jews in Europe, revealing a long-standing undercurrent of anti-Semitism in European history. As I said earlier, the primary impact of the Black Death was demographic. You can see here when you look at this chart that there's a big dip in the population of the 14th century. This massive depopulation is mostly due to the Black Death. Obviously, all this death is going to have far-reaching effects on medieval Europe economically, politically, and culturally. When you have millions of people die, it's going to leave its mark on the economy, politics, and culture. When you're surrounded by so much death, and gruesome death at that, it's understandable that you would develop a darker outlook on life. This hopeless and gruesome atmosphere had a big impact on the culture of the late Middle Ages and is reflected in their art and literature. For example, wood carvings like the one seen here reflects kind of the morbid fascination that people had with death as these skeletons dance on a fresh grave. This disease didn't just hurt people physically, but psychologically as well, and is really responsible for transforming many pious Christians into believers in the omnipotence of death, rather than the infallibility of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. Economically, the impact of the plague is really mixed. Obviously, towns are going to be hit harder than the countryside. The more where people are and they're interacting, that's where the plague is going to hit people the hardest. Because if you recall from like the previous slide, this disease is going to be really transferred through like interaction and cultural diffusion, which is going to come about as a result of trade. So obviously towns are going to be hit harder than the countryside. But the economic results of losing millions of people are really significant on the economy. There's a real shortage of workers, and many crops just lay rotting in the fields because there's no one left to harvest them. This is going to lead to shortages of food and higher prices. However, the availability of laborers is going to be low due to the huge loss of life, and this is going to result in wages going up. Laborers are going to be able to demand higher wages because there's a labor shortage. If they don't have enough workers to go around, then those workers are going to be able to demand more pay. This is going to make it possible for the peasants to kind of throw off the last remnants of serfdom and the old manor system that was common in the Middle Ages. The second big crisis in the late Middle Ages was the 100 Years' War between Britain and France. During 1337 to 1353, France and England also grappled with each other in a bitter conflict known as the 100 Years' War, which roughly lasts, you guessed it, 100 years. This conflict was made even more devastating with the use of gunpowder and heavy artillery brought from Asia. You may or may not remember this from Global History 1 last year, but most students have at least heard of Joan of Arc, probably the most famous participant in this war. The 100 Years' War was really a sign of the growing power of national monarchies, who were often in conflict with each other, none more so than Britain and France in the 14th century. The 100 Years' War devastated both kingdoms at almost every level and really shows us that the decentralized feudal system was breaking down. This is going to be just one more event that really spells the beginning of the end of serfdom, and is really the beginning of this trend of increasing centralization and the growing power of the monarch. In the late 14th century, a schism emerged within the Roman Catholic Church, which led to the election of competing popes, one in Rome and the other in France, each of whom claimed to be the true head of the Roman Catholic Church. This schism lasts almost 40 years and really undermined the Roman Catholic Church's authority. Think about it. It's really hard to maintain your position as the sole religious authority if you're having a civil war within your own walls. Have you ever heard that old expression, a house divided against itself cannot stand? Well, it applies to the Roman Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages. There were rivalries and divisions within the Roman Catholic Church in the 14th century, and this is only going to get worse with Martin Luther's posting of the 95 Theses and the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The last big event that really spells the end of the medieval world and helps lay the foundation for the modern era is the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. We're going to talk about this event much more in depth in our unit on the causes of European exploration, but what I'd like you to appreciate about this event now is how Europeans must have viewed it. When the Ottoman cannons bombarded the famous walls of Constantinople, conquering the last bastion of Christianity in the Middle East, Europeans saw this as a big threat. The Muslim armies were gathering at the gate, and Europeans were really worried that they would soon march into kind of Europe proper. Clearly, the medieval system is no longer working for Europe by the 14th century because of all the things we just talked about. The collapse of the old system is now going to make room for new ideas and innovations like humanism and the printing press, a new economy, this one based on trade, and a new, more centralized political system. All in all, the old medieval society must break down before a new modern society can be created. All right, that's all that I have for you today. Please remember to jot down any questions that you have or anything you're confused about, and I'll be sure to clarify in class when we review this content. Until next time.